My name is Carson. If we haven't had the chance to meet before, I know that felt like a lot of unnecessary theatrics, but I was just getting the jitters out because I'm always so excited to be back here with you guys at our online campus, and I want to say thanks a million for choosing to join us, to share some of your time with us today. There's a couple things you need to know before we head into service. Like, if you're here for the first time, we have a special gift for you. It is a mystery shrouded in a riddle, wrapped in an enigma, and we want to send it to you right in the mail. We're going to ship it to your doorstep. All you have to do to claim your mystery gift is we're going to ask, would you fill out our connection card? The connection card is just a great tool that we have around here that helps you get connected. It helps us know that you're new so we can say hello, and you can fill out the connection card with as much or as little information as you feel comfortable. Just make sure you give us somewhere to send that first time gift. While you're there, you can use that connection card to request prayer, to get plugged in. Maybe you want to know more about groups that are launching in the fall or events that are going on around here. We can help you out with whatever you need. But speaking of events, we have a worship night coming up at our Racine campus. So all of our campuses are invited regardless of where you're watching from today, but we are meeting in a physical space at our Racine campus. And you want to know a little bit more about what worship night is, check out this promo.
You turn crazy to gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can.
We hope that promo gets you hype about worship night, an evening of reflecting on the goodness of God and the ways that He moves, an evening of worshiping Him together, and an evening of looking forward to what He will continue to do in our lives as long as we show up and say yes. We hope to see you there Sunday, September 26th, again, held at our Racine campus, but everyone is invited. So be sure to mark that calendar and check out more at the events page at greatlakeschurch.com. And while you're at greatlakeschurch.com, we would love to invite you to give today, because this mission is only made possible when we're doing it together. And here's something really cool that I discovered this week, is that through all of our streaming platforms over the last year, we have seen over 30,000 hours of our Great Lakes Church content consumed. We've seen people visit us from over 100 different countries right here online. And the cool thing is that the good news of Jesus is made possible to spread. Hope is made accessible because we are partnering together with our generosity. And so we invite you to be a part of that journey with us if you're passionate about the mission of this place. And if you'd like to link arms, you can do that at greatlakeschurch.com on the Give page. It's real simple to set up, and we want to say thank you for being a part of it with us. Now, I'm not going to keep you much longer. I am going to let you know we're continuing our summer school series this week, because when we stop learning, we stop growing. And let's be real, I don't think any of us want to stop growing. And this week's talk is uber practical, uber relevant. Dave is going to be here in just a second. We hope that you enjoy the talk.
Well, hello, everybody. I want to say thank you for joining us online, whether you're watching us or you're listening to us. We just love having a group of people, a tribe of sorts, that is engaged with us here at Great Lakes Church. My name's Dave, and it is good to have you with us. So here's the deal. All of us have moments in our life that we have either watched unfold or we've personally been a part of that created such discomfort and such awkwardness inside of us that those moments got burned into our memories. Now, I have plenty of these stories and these moments in my life, and I know you do as well. As I was thinking about them over the past week, I realized a lot of them have taken place while I've been a pastor. So years ago, I was officiating a ceremony for a couple, Jeremy and Kristen, and in the middle of their ceremony, or actually at the start of their ceremony, I'm welcoming everybody, I'm praying for them, and it's probably 5 minutes in where she finally has the courage to lean over to me, and she says, Dave, my name's not Kristen. It's Lisa. And I'm like, oh my gosh, right? And so I just tried to play it off, and I said, apparently, Kristen changed her name to Lisa a few weeks ago and never told me. And I'm thinking there's going to be some laughter. Crickets. Welcome to the story of my life. Right? I still remember that. Another moment that I remember was when I was on staff at a church in San Diego. And I oversaw our children and student ministries. And I did something one day that I assure you I never did before and I have never done since, all right? I was in my 20s. I was immature. I'm leading this group of people. But the story is this, that one of my employees pulls into the parking lot one day, and I look around, nobody else around, so I'm going to be funny. At least in my mind, I'm funny, right? And so I pull out my hands, and I flip both birds. Yes, I just flip them off, and, I just want to see their reaction. And I don't smile, I just kind of look pretty stern. Well, they pull over, and they get out of their car, and I kid you not, it was not my employee. It was somebody I had never even met before who was showing up to the church that day. And I just walked over to them and I said, I'm so embarrassed. I don't even know what to say to you. I thought you were one of my employees. I said, which doesn't, of course, sound any better, but I was trying to have fun with them. And so to this day, that moment is marked in my memory. And then a few years ago, I'm at a Racine campus, and we have this tower with glass windows, and I was in the second story of this tower. And I thought my friend Justin Matthews was pulling into the parking lot because it was the same vehicle that Justin drives. So I jump up into the window, I pull up my shirt, go bare-chested against the window, and I'm pushing it. And as I'm looking down, sure enough, it's not Justin. It's a friend of mine, Kimberly Freight, from the Racine campus. And I'm just totally embarrassed. It was like one of the most awkward moments. And so I had to run down from the tower. I had to go find her. And I said, Kimberly, I promise you, I did not think it was you. I thought it was Justin. She's like, I've already called my husband. I've already told him this is weird. And so we all have those moments, right? And the reason I bring this up is because today what I want to do is I want to talk about one of the most awkward and uncomfortable experiences that we're all confronted with from time to time in our life. And that is not really knowing what to say or do when someone experiences a significant loss. And so today, as part of our summer teaching series that we're calling Summer School, and each week we're just taking on a different topic, what I want to do is I want to talk about how to comfort a grieving friend. That's an incredibly important topic, right? Because it's a topic that, as it unfolds, it creates this awkwardness and this discomfort in us. And it really shouldn't, because, hey, everybody has a story of loss. Right? We all have stories of someone we love that we've lost, or an experience, something, maybe it was the loss of a marriage, or the loss of a job, or a dream. We all have that in common. It's the one thing that every single one of us can relate to. We know what it's like to lose someone or something, or to lose out on something. And yet, when it comes to interacting with the person who is grieving a loss, even though we all have loss in common, most of us do not know what to say or do. We feel awkward. And the reason we feel awkward is because when it comes to grieving our losses, everybody grieves differently. We're all unique, right? Some are very private in their grieving, and other people, they're very expressive. Some people in their grieving, they withdraw from others. Other people, they try to stay as busy as possible, and it's kind of a distraction in their life, but everybody grieves differently. And so let's talk about how to comfort someone who is grieving a loss. What does that look like? Well, one of the things we need to know about loss is that people don't get over loss. They get through it. Right? People don't get over deep loss. You don't get over the loss of a child. You don't get over the loss of an amazing friendship. You don't get over the loss of what you thought was a great marriage or an amazing career, but then for whatever reason, it was cut short. But you can get through it. And so today, as we talk about this, what I want to do is I want to look at one of the oldest and one of the most famous stories in our Bible about loss. Okay? It's a story about a guy named Job. And at the start of Job's story, at the start of his biography, here's what we read. We read, there once was a man from Nantucket. No, we don't. There once was a man named Job, right, who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. So, Job is a good man. He is a godly man. as his story unfolds, we learn that he was a faithful husband. He was a devoted father. He was an incredibly wealthy landowner, like the wealthiest guy in the area. So, as you can imagine, Job's on top of the world. Yeah, I'm sure he was an Olympic athlete for the land of Uz, which, by the way, is in southern Israel. Right? But Job is living the good life. And then, dun, 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 right? In just a very short period of time, things change. Job, he goes from being on top of the world to the bottom of the world because he starts to experience this avalanche of losses in his life. We read that his farms were overtaken by terrorists. His servants and his animals, they're either captured or slaughtered. All of his children, they're gathered together at a party at one of the brothers' house, and then they die in a freak accident. It's just bizarre. The house just collapses in on them. And then, on top of all that, Job's own health is affected. There's painful boils that just break out all over his body. So again, he goes from being on top of the world to being on the bottom. Now, this is fascinating to me because here's a guy, Job, who loves God. He's committed to serving God. He's trying to live a life that honors God, but he's absolutely human. He can only take so much. And so as these losses in his life start to pile up, it's understandable. Job hits a breaking point. And by the 3rd chapter of his book, we read that he's angry and he's depressed and he's scared and he starts asking lots and lots of why questions. In fact, here's some of the questions Job asks. He asks, why wasn't I born dead? Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? We've all asked questions like this, right, when we're overwhelmed. Like, hey, why would God allow me to be born if he knew that my life was going to be this stressful and this miserable? Why would God allow me to go through this? Why would he allow me to experience this? What kind of loving God is that? Now, we have to remember, this is a story that took place 4,000 years ago, right? It's unfolding at a time in history. We don't have scientific or words or psychological understanding for what Job is going through. Thankfully, today, right, 2021, we have a much greater understanding of grief. And what we understand about grief through research is that grief typically happens in different stages. Now, the research isn't perfect, right? Not everybody is going to go through every stage necessarily. And even if they do go through every stage, it's not always in a logical order. It's not always sequential. Sometimes the stages are going to overlap. But for the most part, there is agreement among people who study grieving that there is somewhere between 5 and 7 stages of grief. And so just to make this real practical, let me give you an example of the stages of grief, right? Here's a graphic for you to look at. The first stage of grief typically is shock. Right? This is the stage where we hear the news of a death. We learn that our job is being cut. Something happened to our kid that's going to affect their health for the rest of their life, and we're just paralyzed by the news. Well, the next stage often, again, not every time does it follow the order, but often is sorrow. And this is when we start to experience a profound and deep sadness. There's depression, maybe anger. We start feeling emotions we never knew we had. And eventually, you get to a point where there's a struggle that takes place inside of you. You're overwhelmed. You feel hopeless. You're asking lots and lots of why questions like Job did. Maybe you feel guilt over something you should have said or did. But the fourth stage would be a stage of surrender. It's a stage where you start to accept what's happened. You start being hopeful. Maybe you're praying that God brings something good out of it. And then hopefully we get to the final stage. Right? The stage where we have a sensitivity, we feel way more connected to God and to others, that we have a greater empathy for what people are going through. So if somebody goes through the same kind of loss that we went through, maybe the loss of a marriage, maybe a financial loss that was very significant, we see it through a different lens. And the Apostle Paul actually says this is the way it should be. He writes on one of his letters, God comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. He says when they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. So that's the goal. The goal is that we get to a point where we're sensitive to God and we're feeling way more connected with God and we're sensitive to others. And so the question is, how do we come alongside someone and comfort someone who is grieving a loss, regardless of what stage of loss that they are in? How do we respond when a friend gets a rejection letter from their grad school, right? Or when they learn they've been laid off from a job that they love? How do we respond when someone receives an incredibly difficult diagnosis from a doctor? Or maybe when they've shared the news of their pregnancy with everybody they know and now they've lost the baby. Because in those moments, most of us, just because we're human, we feel stuck. It just feels awkward. So I don't know what to say. Like, God, help me, help my friend. I don't know what to do. Now, thankfully, when Job experienced these tidal waves of losses in his life, he had some close friends that came alongside him. And when they did, they became a source of comfort to him during that time. And so I want to read to you a little bit here about Job's friends. There were three of them very specifically, all right? And so when three of Job's friends heard of the tragedy he had suffered, they got together and they traveled from their homes to comfort and console him. Their names were Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Right? And we could add Iron Man, the Seattleite, and Hercules, the Brooklynite, and Batman, the Gothamite. I mean, these are just fascinating names, right? And I just love it because Job has friends who care so much about him that when they hear about his losses, they just pretty much drop everything to be with him. They don't call. They don't text. They just show up. That is what good friends do. And when they see their friend Job, and they're out in a distance when they first see him, they become incredibly emotional. And the reason why is they don't even recognize him. His body is covered with boils. So physically, he just looks different. Years ago, I had a friend who was living in another part of the country, and they lost their son to cancer. I was unable to attend the funeral. And as a matter of fact, it was a few years before I was actually able to go visit them in person. And I got to tell you, when I did, they weren't the same person. It was just so clear that the loss had taken a toll on them physically and emotionally and relationally. Even as we talked, socially, it was just different. And that's what happened to Job. And his friends show up, and they barely recognize him. Again, it was physical at that point, but here's what they do. We read that, then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and nights. No one said a word to Job, for they saw that his suffering was too great for words. When someone is in the midst of an incredibly dark moment in their life, or maybe a dark season in their life, or they're just overwhelmed, often the greatest gift that we can give them is called the gift of presence. It's when we choose to be fully present with them in the midst of their suffering, and we choose to say very, very little. Now, as you can imagine, that takes a lot of discipline to just keep our mouth shut. But that is exactly what Job's friends do, right? They show up, and they see their friend, they give him a hug, they say, hey, Job, we are so sorry for your loss. They say, we wish we had the right words, but we don't. We just want you to know that we care. And then they shut up. They don't start giving Job a bunch of platitudes. Hey, man, we're sorry to hear what you're going through, but here's what we know. God is still on the throne. Right? They don't say that. They don't look at Job and say, hey, just know God never gives you more than you can handle, so I know you're overwhelmed right now, but you're going to get through this. Nope. They just sit there because he's in deep, deep pain. This is a great lesson for all of us, right? When we're trying to comfort someone in the midst of their grieving, know this. The deeper the pain, the fewer words we should use. So if you're talking to somebody and they got into a fender bender, the truth is you can talk to them for 2 or 3 hours, right? You can make fun of them. You can say, were you drinking? You can just kind of talk about their driving and do you need new glasses? Was it their fault? Was it your fault? Right? You can have fun with that all day long. But if they have experienced a truly deep loss, you show up and just know there's nothing you can say that will help. They don't need your words. They need you. And you can say, hey, I'm sorry for your loss, right? It's not like you're going to absolutely say nothing, right? You can say, I love you, but be very, very careful with how much you're talking. Now, to be clear, if someone you know loses somebody or they go through a loss in life and you're not really close to them, it's probably wise to actually not show up in person, right? Just know you can show up by sending a text, a phone call, you can send a card. There's different ways to show up based on our level of relationship. But the bottom line is do not allow the awkwardness of not knowing what to say or do paralyze you from doing something. And so we read that Job's friends show up, right? They're present. They listen to him talk about his losses. They are doing everything right. But then, Pay attention to this, right? Then they get impatient. They're doing so good. But then they feel like they have to give Job answers for what he's going through. Here's Job. He's in the early stages of grieving. And his friend Eliphaz speaks up. And he says, Job, things are going to get better. Here's what we read. Eliphaz says, you will have many children. Your descendants will be as plentiful as grass. You will go to the grave at a ripe old age like a sheaf of grain harvested at the proper time. So he's saying, hey, Job, I know you lost your children, but come on, man, you're still young, right? You'll have more children. I know it feels like your life's over, but come on. You've got decades ahead of you. I promise you, you'll have time to recover your losses. Better days are still ahead. I'm behind you, Job. Now, Eliphaz is speaking words of hope. He's speaking words of encouragement, which is great, okay? We all need that. But his timing is absolutely terrible. Absolutely terrible. The right words spoken at the wrong time do more harm than good. So when someone is grieving the loss of a miscarriage, you don't early on in the process say, well, have you thought about having more kids after this? Right? You don't say, hey, have you ever considered adoption if it's been a while and that they've been trying, it's been a difficult. You don't say, hey, have you talked to doctors about in vitro fertilization? No, there's going to be time for great conversation at some point, but not early on. The right words spoken at the wrong time do not bring comfort. All right, and then you have the next friend, right, that speaks up to Job. His name's Bildad. He needs to get a new name, right? And he's listening to Job, and he's hearing Job express his pain and go through these emotions, and eventually he just feels like, I better give Job my thoughts. And he says to Job, he says, hey, listen, if you think logically about this, there's actually a reason that you've lost everything. I'm not making this up. Here's what he says. He says, your children must have sinned against God, so their punishment was well deserved. In other words, come on, man. Job, you know karma is a real thing. And apparently your kids were not as good as they led you to believe because they must have gotten what they deserved. Right? That's like somebody telling you that they're scared because they've received a concerning health diagnosis from the doctor, and your response is, hey, well, when your entire diet ends in Etos, right? Fritos, Cheetos, Doritos, taquitos, right? Hey, what do you expect to happen? Right? Maybe you should eat something that's not cooked by a high schooler and hand it to you in the car after you ordered it from some clown. Maybe what you should be doing is going and finding a vegetable and praying to God for the courage to actually eat it. Now, obviously, you would never say that. Nobody would say it to another. That would be ridiculous. And I wish that I could tell you that when you go through pain, nobody will say anything dumb to you. But here's what I know about life. Somebody will. And the reason I know that is because you have said dumb things to people, just like I have. A couple months ago, a friend of mine was sharing with me about how one of their friends had hurt them in a pretty significant way. And I had heard them talk about this friend on a couple of different occasions. And without even thinking about it, I mean, I just didn't even hardly let there be a pause. I asked them, I said, hasn't this friend hurt you before? I said, why do you keep allowing them back into your life? In some ways, this is your fault. You're bringing it on yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why I'm not a therapist. Right? I thought about it later. I was like, that's dumb. I shouldn't have said that. I should have had some empathy. But you've said similar things, right? You show up, it's like, hey, the good news is she lived a long life. And there's lots of people who die young, but man, God gave her a long life. Or hey, God wanted another angel. That's why he took your daughter. Or I know you lost your job after 25 years. Thankfully, we're in a good job market, though. I'm betting you can make money off your house if you have to move. Or there's a reason for everything. Right? Or it's all part of God's plan. When people are grieving, they filter almost everything that they hear through the lens of their emotions. So we have to be very, very careful. And so here's Job's friend, Bildad. He's trying to make sense of everything, and he feels like there's really only two options here. We're going to either blame God or blame Job. And since he's not going to blame God, what he does is he points his finger at Job, and he basically says, hey, these misfortunes that you're going through, it's your fault. He says, you need to start living better. You need to really refocus on integrity. You need to make things right with God because at some point, something you did was not right, and God's punishing you. Right? That is not what someone needs to hear when they are experiencing grief. When someone is grieving a loss in their life, they pretty much need to hear two things. Number one, you're not crazy. And number two, you're not alone. Right? You're not crazy. You're not crazy for feeling what you feel and thinking what you think. Right? Your emotions are totally normal. It is absolutely part of being human. Grieving does not mean that you're spiritually weak. Right? I think we all need to be reminded of that. It doesn't mean we're spiritually weak. Guys especially need to be reminded of this, because for guys, our tendency is to bottle up our emotions. Right? It's like a can of soda. So you get a can of soda and you just have it shaking, right? And all this condensation's pulling off here. But if I were to open this, which I'm not going to, right, it would explode everywhere. And guys can be like that when it comes to their emotions. And so we need to be reminded in times of loss that, hey, we're not crazy and we're not alone, right? And that's our job to communicate that to the person going through grief. Now, eventually, Job's third friend is a guy named Zophar. He speaks up. And he offers some very, very spiritual sounding advice. And what Zophar says is, if only you would prepare your heart and lift up your eyes to him, to God in prayer. Oh, if you would just look up, right? And you just get rid of your sins and leave all your iniquity behind you. He says, if you do that, you will forget your misery. It will be like water flowing away. What Zophar does is he tries to put a Bible Band-Aid on Job's wounds. He says, you need to pray, you need to repent, you need to live a life of integrity, and I promise you, things are going to get better, Job. Will you hear me on this? Do not interrupt someone's pain and try to explain it to them. Even if you're able to answer the why behind what's happening and explain why something is happening, it's not going to help. Right? Knowing why the hurricane happened does not help the people who are living in the devastation left behind. Knowing the why doesn't help anybody. Now, personally, the most significant loss I've ever gone through in my life is the loss of my brother, Ricky. And if you've been a part of the Great Lakes Church community for a while, you've heard me talk about this. Rick was killed in Iraq back in 2008. He was a Marine. If you're unfamiliar with his story, you can actually Google his name. You could just go Richard Nelson Marine, and there's plenty of articles that will pull up and different pictures. But when I look back to that time in my life, there's a handful of pictures and a handful of memories that are burned into my mind that came about as a result of that very, very difficult season in our family's life. And the first of those pictures is from Rick's wedding in April of 2007. And when you look at this picture, you see my parents and Rick and Kristen and the joy and the happiness. I mean, it is a time of new beginnings. The second picture that's burned in my mind took place almost exactly a year later. It was April of 2008. And you see the grief on my parents' face, and you see the grief in Kristen, and you see what loss does. Now, I've been a pastor for 25 years, and I got to tell you, I still rarely know what to say or do in moments like that. But one of the things I will always remember is the amount of people who chose to reach out. And I want to encourage you, when someone is grieving a loss, choose to walk into the awkwardness. Choose to show up and give the gift of presence. That might be your physical presence. It might be a card, phone call, text, right? Depending on level of relationship, but show up. Say, I'm sorry about your loss. I'm so sorry to hear what you're going through. I care about you. I'm praying for you. When our family lost Rick, we had so many people who just chose to walk into the awkwardness. I'm going to tell you, it gave our family strength as we moved through the different stages of grief. And I wish I had the opportunity in a way that everybody who showed up in that season could be thanked. Because they showed up in so many ways, right? They did it with their presence, they did it with their words, they did it with their time. And in the weeks and months that followed, I got to tell you, there were many people who just showed up by doing things that we never asked them to do. And it actually taught me an important lesson in that season, and that is when somebody is going through loss, right, they're grieving a loss, I think it's important to do something instead of offering anything. So when someone is grieving, you got to know they're in shock, right, especially initially. They're in shock. They don't even know what they need. So just show up and bring something, do something. That might be you show up and you bring bottled water to their house, or you send them a gift card or a couple of gift cards for meals. If they've got young children, maybe you just offer to babysit or pay for a sitter. If they're not really anal about their lawn, maybe you go mow their lawn. If you're going to talk to them and ask questions, which of course you can talk to them, but you start asking questions, I think it's important we ask answerable questions, right? Because you ask somebody, well, how are you? That's not the best question. Well, I just lost my kid. I just lost my job. I just lost my marriage. How do you think I am? What's helpful is to ask very specific questions like, how are you doing today? How did you sleep last night? Personally, when somebody loses a family member, that's always a tough one to really deal with, right? One of the things that I will do is I will ask, what are some of your favorite memories of this person? What are you going to miss most about this person? I ask, what is one thing I can be praying for you about this week? And then personally, if I tell someone I'm going to pray for them, I will, about 80, 90% of the time, I'll actually text them the prayer. And I do it all the time. I text them the prayer so they know that I pray. But instead of offering, instead of asking, hey, what can I do? Just do something, right? Now, the end of the book of Job, I'm just going to tell you, it's not emotionally satisfying. God doesn't give Job an explanation for everything he's gone through. And it's frustrating because, we're hoping, here's Job, he's desperate for God to fix everything. God doesn't fix everything. God doesn't just step in through time and space and end his grieving process. He chooses to allow Job to go through it. And so our job is not to try to fix the loss or try to save people from whatever stage of grief that they are in. Our job is to be present with people during the grieving process. Remember, people do not get over loss. They get through it. And when someone's in pain, we help them by being a bridge from despair to hope. That's our job. We're going to walk with them in their pain. One day, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says this to them. He says, here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. He says, pain's a part of life. Difficulty is a part of life. He says, but take heart because I have overcome the world. So he says, suffering's real. It's never going away. It's part of being human. But he also says, God is bigger than the pain. God can bring beauty out of the ashes. God can cause good to come from the bad. And so when we come to the end of Job's story, it's kind of fascinating because what happens is Job actually stops focusing on the why questions. And he starts focusing on the who. He focuses his heart on the faithfulness of God and the love of God and the mercy of God and the fact that God has been with him in everything he's been going through. And eventually, Job actually comes to this conclusion about God. He says, I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. He didn't say, God, thank you. I feel like now I have all the answers. I feel so much better that I went through these very difficult times and these stages of loss. He says, but God, here's the deal. You've been faithful to me in the different stages of grief. God eventually does restore his losses. God eventually, Job eventually has more kids. He's got more wealth. I mean, things happen. But I got to tell you this, it's not the same life. It's not the same kids. I'm sure if Job could push a button, he would and say, hey, I have my old life back. Now, let me just wrap up with this thought. Over the past year and a half, there has been a growing list of people who have lost someone or something. Right? They've lost a loved one, they've lost a job, they've lost a marriage, maybe they've lost a battle with an addiction, or they've lost out on something. They've lost out on a prom or graduation or the birth of a grandchild. I mean, it's just an endless list. And it's important to know this because what's going to happen is as the losses start catching up with people and they start realizing what they've lost, I think we're going to be hit with a tsunami of grief in our country. And my prayer for you and my prayer for myself, my prayer for Great Lakes Church is that we are equipped to help people in the midst of their loss. And it's possible that today you're personally feeling suffocated from the different losses that you've gone through. And so I want to end our time together by praying for you. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are a God who heals. You are a God who restores. You are a God who brings beauty out of ashes. You're a God who gives hope in the midst of despair. And I pray for my friends today who are experiencing different losses and who are grieving in different stages. And I pray, God, that you would be very real to all of us in the different stages of grief that we're in, and that we would be able to eventually say, as a result of the stages of grief that we go through, the same thing that Job said. like I have seen God in a new way, in a fresh way. And I realize that God has been faithful and his mercies have been made new every morning. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.